Good morning. This is World War One, Part 2. We had talked about the causes of the war in the prior webcast. So now we're going to see what happened in the early stages of the war. And basically, once again, this is an overview. More specifics will be covered on the Google Slides. So I really don't want to step on our great students' toes who will be presenting many of the key events, people, and changes during the war. So we left with the major powers of Europe quickly becoming entangled in, look, this is going to be called the war to end all wars. It will not end wars, sadly, but it will have the most casualties of any war up to this point in time in history. So let's see what happens with the Germans who are trying to employ their Schleifen plan. Okay, here's a few sound effects again. Once again, we have the Central Powers, which will be headed by Germany, Austria, Hungary. Italy's trying to wait to see who might win this war or go to the highest bidder at this time. So they're on the sidelines for the moment. And you have the Triple Entente with the French, British, and Russians heading that. Okay. So the Germans are going to be executing the Schlieffen Plan. They will be quickly deep into France. It's August and September. By August 24th, they will be within 35 miles of Paris. Their army is the strongest in Europe at this time. But despite the fact that the Belgians are going to be they're going to get through Belgium quickly, they're going to hold them up enough that it will delay, to a certain degree, a total German victory in French. They fought valiantly. So the French are going to be managed to wear down the German offensive into September, and they will launch a counterattack at the Marne River in September that forced some of the German armies to retreat. So the Germans will fortify their positions by digging deep into trenches. This will be a battle this will be a war of trench warfare. If I was to go back in time and you asked me, look, I don't want to go back to any wars, but if you told me one war, you definitely check one off the list you wouldn't want to go back to, I would say World War One. The conditions are going to be very, very tough. Trench warfare for 4 years, living in a trench with very little food and shelter, and the casualty rate is going to be enormous. That's the one I would least like to go back to. Okay, a little editorial review there for you. So the British and the French British are going to come to the French aid at this time. They're going to dig in. The Germans are going to dig in. And by the end of the year, you're going to have 300,000 killed between these powers and 600,000 wounded. They're not going to be home by Christmas. And this is going to the Battle of the Marne, which this will be called, will end any potential success of the Schlieffen Plan. One of the reasons is the new weapons. This is going to dramatically change the nature of battle. Most of these generals are fighting with Civil War tactics. You know, the era of the Civil War where you line up your army, I line up my army, and I charge yours. That's not going to work with this new weaponry. We'll learn about some of that weaponry shortly. Okay, so this will end any hopes of a quick victory. No more German offensive war. This becomes a defensive war. Once again, you're no longer using the rifle and the bayonet. You now have the machine guns, artillery, later tanks going to be the weapons of choice Okay. So the frontline soldier is going to have to live under a thunder of barrages, you know, falling shells, weapons of mass destruction that the powers of Europe had never seen before. Remember, since the Congress of Vienna, you've had basically relative peace for 100 years. And the living conditions, once again, in the trenches, not very nice. They're going to be hampered with lice, rats, stagnant water, lack of supplies, sanitation. I'm going to show you a lot of pictures. This is the Civil War cannon. These are the guns that are going to be used that could be fired miles away. This will be the #1 killer in the war. Shells just constantly blasting. And then, you're going to have the psychological effects of hearing this day in and day out. They're going to call that shell shock. There's the Civil War Gatling gun. And these machine guns are going to be much more deadly. You're going to see also poison gas, so that's why you see the mask on these soldiers. Here are some of the lines that are going to be drawn, and they're not going to move too much in the next 4 years, and millions are going to die. Here you see the Battle of the Marne. You're going to have the Battle of Verdun. Some of the battles will be talked about by our students. This is the Big Bertha gun used by Germany. And tanks are not going to be, as you can see here, too effective in the beginning of the war. But one thing about war, the engineers and architects get better as wars go on. So by the end of the war, the tanks will have a greater impact, but not like to the extent that you'll see later in World War II. So no man's land is going to be a territory between the warring powers. This is where a lot of people are going to be sent to their death, trying to take over the opposing trench. Mostly this will be wasteland that had been shelled for years, lots of barbed wire, and there's going to be an order given by the generals called over the top to charge the enemy. And, when you're going up against these new weapons, as you can see, this type of protective gear is not going to be too effective. If we ever get back to school, Mr. Weinstein's grandfather has his World War I helmet. Mr. Weinstein has it in one of the cases. And over the top.
Abandon ship. This is not a drill.
We're going to have U-boats, submarines, used by both powers, but U-boats are going to be the ones created by the Germans to try to encircle Great Britain and not allow any supplies into Great Britain. And Great Britain's also going to try to prevent the Germans from receiving supplies. There's an old debate. What's going to win the war, guns or butter? Butter meaning food. Who's going to run out of food first, run out of supplies first? These are the Zeppelins, flying airships created. Mostly they will be used to look at the battlefield from above, try to get some intelligence. Flamethrowers and grenade launchers, some other modern warfare. Poison gas will not be the deadliest weapon, but it will psychologically bring the greatest fear. And the machine gun, of course, will kill millions of people. So by both sides digging in, this will create a stalemate. Neither side is going to gain a significant advantage during this time. And this stalemate will lead to the highest casualties and deaths ever in a war up to this point, with little territorial gain. So you can imagine the difficulty it will be waging this war, especially in wintertime. Deaths everywhere. Talked about shell shock. Some pictures of trench warfare. Conditions are less than ideal. And most of the pictures that you see during this time, you're not going to see a lot of smiles. You're not going to see a lot of clean uniforms. You can see the shell barrages that occurred throughout the war. Interesting story. Adolf Hitler fought for the Germans during this time. He was, this is not the photo with Adolf Hitler in it, but he was standing with a group of men at one time. I'm not sure if he had to go to the bathroom or he just left the group for a moment. When he came back, a shell had hit the group where he was standing, and all the men, or most of the men that had been there, were killed. It kind of was a moment of reckoning for him. He thought he had been spared for a greater purpose. Here's a little artistic drawing of some of the rats that were often written about in these conditions. One of the major reasons I wouldn't want to go back to this war. Mustard gas. This will also be fought in the air and the seas. Airplanes in the beginning, much like tanks, will not be very effective, but by the end, you're not going to have it, obviously, to the extent of World War II, where you have these massive bombers, but you're going to have what are these flying aces fighting it out over the skies of Europe. Would later inspire the Peanuts writer Charles Schulz, as Snoopy will be dramatized as one of these fighters fighting against the Red Baron. So you are not going to have the bombing that you probably know of World War II. But as the war develops, they will start dropping more bombs and grenades. And the German Red Baron is probably one of the more noteworthy flying aces. And you see some statistics there. That's what a plane looked like by 1917. Here are some of the more notable flying aces. We talked about the Red Baron. Eddie Rickenbacker was the most famous from the United States. And we talked about Snoopy years later in one of his famous episodes of the Peanuts. So the British, as we had talked about, always had their great navy, but the German dreadnoughts were now developed, were huge ships. They had their U-boats, of course, and they were trying to seize the seas and block British ports from getting supplies. So they would start to depend on unrestricted submarine warfare in the Atlantic Ocean, and ultimately the United States is going to be affected by this policy. And there is, once again, another photo of a dreadnought. So the war will continue to rage on. Many of you are going to be presenting, once again, many of the specifics in your Google slides. So the Allied offenses in 1915 and 1916 failed at breaking the stalemate. A couple of the key things that you'll be learning about. The British will lose 300,000 men in 1915 alone, a very deadly year. 1 in 4 teenagers and British citizens in their early 20s will be killed. You're going to lose a whole generation of Europeans during this war. The Germans themselves will take 615,000 casualties during this time. The French will have over 1 million killed in 1915. Look, the war is being fought in France. In 1915, Italy will enter the war on the Allied side. On the Eastern Front, the war is going to be even deadlier, especially for the Russians. Um, Britain and Turkey will be, the British will lose a lot in Turkey. The war is going to carry into the Middle East. We'll learn about that. Japan will enter the war on the Allied side. Don't get confused. Okay, Japan actually fighting on the Allied side in this war. Um, the Russian armies will advance into eastern Prussia during this time, despite the incompetence of the Russian general staff. They are just going to lose person after person. They will have the most men, but be the least equipped. Hungary and Germany could not overcome the fact they had to fight the war on two fronts. This is going to plague them. Okay. 1 million Russian soldiers will be killed or wounded in the front during this year. Another million are going to be captured. As we get into the Middle East, we're going to see some battles there. The British military and political leaders were divided between those who believed that victory could be won and lost, and others like Winston Churchill and David Lloyd George pushed for a series of dramatic strikes against Germany or its allies in the Middle East. Churchill, the First Lord, Lord Kitchener, planned an attack on Germany's ally, Turkey. The Turks had closed off the Dardanelles Strait, which separates the Aegean Sea from the Sea of Marmara. This cut off important routes for supplies to Russia through the Black Sea. Turkey also posed a potential threat to the Suez Canal. So Churchill argued with Turkey out of the war, the German effort in the Balkans could be undermined. So if they could get Turkey out, this was Churchill's main objective. Following a month-long bombardment of Turkish forts, a predominantly British fleet of 13 battleships entered the Dardanelles Strait in March 1915. They're going to run into a lot of landmines placed in the straits. They will have to retreat, and they will return in April, and they will send 5 divisions to the beach of Gallipoli, and you'll have the Battle of Gallipoli. And this will be a territory well defended by the Turks. Half of the 400,000 British troops were killed or wounded and forced to evacuate in January 1916. The British also fought a desert war against the Turks in Palestine and Mesopotamia. So the war is going to take a deadly, deadly turn. Okay. This is a territory that the Russians will later have to give up in the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, which will probably be covered, should be covered by our students in our Google Slides. And we talked about the war in the Middle East and Africa. Some other major battles that you should know as we end the second part of our webcast. The Battle of Verdun, began in February of 1916. Germany sought a battle of attrition that would bleed France white. And you're going to see both sides becoming more desperate and sending more and more men into battle. The French are going to lose 540,000 men. The Germans will lose 430,000 men in the Battle of Verdun, the second bloodiest battle. Okay. The bloodiest battle will be the Battle of the Somme, which began in July of 1916. British and French both unleashed an offensive, and they will try to break the German lines once and for all. The British will lose 420,000 men. The French will lose 200,000 men. and the Germans will lose 650,000 men. Those numbers are staggering. That will be the bloodiest battle of the war. Here's a picture of the Battle of the Somme. 60,000 British troops were killed in one day in this battle. So one of the reasons also that the British are trying to win this front is because of the failure of Gallipoli. They turn their attention to the west. Very, very deadly battle. Okay. So we're going to end the second slide cast there, and we are going to start the third and final one of World War I on the home front.